Tired of paying high taxes on this island or this island? Today, I'm going to show you 13 islands in the world where you can pay zero tax and keep all of the money you make. And let's start in the Americas. Of course, the Caribbean has a lot of well-known islands. And what's interesting about this region is if you want a second citizenship, there's a number of ways you can get it here. Let's start in what's called the British Overseas Territories. These territories are self-governing. They don't follow the UK's tax rates. They often offer 0% tax rates, and yet you can get their passport and then get a UK passport if you want one. So you get a lot of opportunities by living here if you're willing to move full-time to these islands. The first one is the Cayman Islands, 0% tax rate. And what I like about this one is you can set up your company in the Cayman Islands. You can get a long-term promise that tax rate on your business is going to stay at 0%. Your personal income tax is going to be 0%. And you can bring in people from around the world to work in your company. So yes, there is a real estate investment pathway in the Cayman Islands if you just want to buy a property. But if you don't want to spend millions of dollars just to move in, you can start by moving your company. And so for a lot of people who run a business, you need to move your company anyway. Oftentimes, the place you live isn't where you incorporate your company. And this could be a one-stop solution for some people who want that very long-term promise from the government of, we're not going to tax your business. We're going to let your business grow here on top of the zero personal tax rates. And if you live there 9 months a year, you can work towards a Caymanian passport. Nearby, the Turks and Caicos, number 2, same policies, 0% tax. You buy a property, you get a residence permit. Everyone talks about the Cayman Islands. They don't talk as much about Turks and Caicos. You get the same policies there. And number 3, Bermuda. You don't have quite the tropical weather. It is a pretty expensive place to live. All these places are a bit more expensive than elsewhere in the Caribbean. And yet, some people prefer the weather of Bermuda. And so those are 3 British overseas territories where you can live and you have 0 personal taxes. Let's move on now, not to British overseas territories, but members of the British Commonwealth. 2 countries in the Eastern Caribbean, which not only have 0% tax, but also offer citizenship by investment, which means you can get a passport in about a year or less. Number 4, St. Kitts and Nevis, 2 islands in the Eastern Caribbean, sovereign state. Number 5, Antigua and Barbuda, again, 2 islands in the Eastern Caribbean, sovereign state. Both of them declared their independence, and they now offer citizenship to anyone who can make a donation. So unlike the British overseas territories where you're going to start your company in the Caymans or where you're going to buy property as a way of getting in these cases, probably the easiest way to get in is just to get the second citizenship and then live there as a citizen. Now, the price of Caribbean citizenship has gone up recently. The floor is $200,000. Now, the hack that I've told you is you could get citizenship in St. Lucia, for example, as I did, and you have certain privileges that make it easier to go and live in the other Eastern Caribbean states, of which there are 6. So you don't have to be a citizen of St. Kitts or Antigua to live in those countries. I guess that maybe is the easiest way to do it. But you can go and get St. Lucia, Dominica, Grenada. If you have one of those passports, you have an easier path to living in one of these 2 tax-free countries. Now, St. Kitts and Nevis is basically totally tax-free. You may know the actor John Cleese. He has lived on the smaller island of Nevis, and then, of course, the larger island of St. Kitts. 0 tax on pretty much anything there, quite frankly, any kind of income. So that's the more tax-friendly one. Now, Antigua and Barbuda, again, the island of Antigua, the smaller island of Barbuda, they were a bit more strict during COVID, and so some people have avoided them for that reason. We've had clients tell us that. They also have some tax on business, and so you want to make sure you're structuring your business affairs properly. But you can get citizenship in those countries directly as well if you want, and then you can live there for as long as you want. Obviously, a citizen of a country doesn't have to live there, and most people who get citizenship in those countries, they use it for travel purposes and for diversification, as I do. But you could use it to live there 1 day a year, 100 days a year, or all 365 days a year. And if you live in those islands, you will pay 0 tax. Again, Antigua may be a bit more structuring required. Number 6 is the Bahamas. A lot of people know the Bahamas, whether it's some of the gated communities in Nassau, whether it's some of the interesting outer islands, people like Exuma. We've had clients ask about all sorts of different places in the Bahamas. And you can live a totally tax-free lifestyle there. The deal is you get residence by buying a property. The more expensive the property, essentially, the faster they process your application and the longer that you can stay there. As long as you hold that property, you can stay there indefinitely. It is possible to get citizenship, though it's a bit more difficult than some of the other places. There are some privileges in terms of visiting the US as a Bahamian, if that's important to you. One of the things that I've been telling you for years is I think going forward, having a Western passport is going to be less and less advantageous. I'd rather be a citizen with one of these British overseas territories passports and maybe the ability to get a UK passport if I want to. I'd rather be Bahamian, not a bad passport to travel on, for example. But the Bahamas is a place where, whether you want the passport or not, you can go there and live totally tax-free. For a lot of folks who want to go to the United States, they have the ability to do that with their current passport. You can fly pretty darn easily to Miami. These other islands, by the way, have been opening up more service. So the Eastern Caribbean has been getting more service from, for example, American Airlines. So it is getting easier to travel. And then number 7 in the Caribbean, one you probably haven't thought about, and this one doesn't speak English as their official language, it's the Dominican Republic. Now, the Dominican Republic does not have a headline 0% tax rate. What I'm always telling you is you don't always want to pay attention to the headline tax rates. Just as plenty of countries in Europe with very high taxes have special regimes for foreigners coming in to pay very little, the DR has very flexible tax rules. And what those are kind of in tax speak is they don't have CFC or controlled foreign corporation rules. And what that means is if your business is incorporated somewhere else, that money is not necessarily taxed in the DR. And so they say, hey, that money doesn't exist in our system. Now, that's different than most countries. If you live in the United States and you set up a company in the Cayman Islands, for example, the U.S. is going to include that income. Hey, that's great. Congratulations, you put your company in the Cayman Islands, and there may be asset protection benefits or other reasons to do that separate from tax. But you can't live in the U.S. or Canada or most Western countries, have your company in the Cayman Islands and say, hey, well, the company's in the Cayman Islands, I don't have to pay tax. No, the U.S. and all those other big countries found a way to include that income and suck it into their tax net. You're not going to save any money in taxes by doing that. But if you move to the DR, and your companies in the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands or Hong Kong or anywhere else that's tax-free, that company does not have to be taxed in the DR the same way it would be probably in the country that you're living now. And so as long as you avoid what's called PE rules, permanent establishment, so there's certain ways that you have to run your business, for example, you can potentially pay zero tax on your business income. The DR also has an interesting system, and we talked about this in another episode, of 3 years of totally territorial tax, where basically all overseas income is not taxed. After that, your foreign active income is not taxed, but if you have foreign capital gains or dividends, they do include those. Now, there's a way to structure that to where, let's say you have capital gains in some kind of business, that could be structured in a foreign corporation rather than in your own name to where you could potentially avoid that. But basically in the DR, if you structure yourself properly and your business is somewhere else, they don't tax that. Lower cost of living, obviously more up and coming, the fastest growing economy right now in the Americas. And we have Miss Dominican Republic coming to Nomadic Capitalist Live as one of our Beauty and Brains panelists. And she's going to talk about why the DR is the fastest growing economy right now in the hemisphere. Also in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory. Technically, if you have some sort of U.S. immigration permission, you could move to Puerto Rico, is my understanding, and you could take advantage of what they call Act 60. But generally, this is for Americans. And so if you're an American, you do have a harder time moving to other countries and reducing your taxes. Now, Americans often think, hey, we have what's called citizenship-based taxation, and that means that we have to pay taxes no matter where we live. Yes, but you can certainly use the foreign earned income exclusion and plenty of advantages, particularly for entrepreneurs, to dramatically lower your taxes. So if you're an American and you live in the Cayman Islands, you may not be able to reduce your taxes to zero, but you can still dramatically reduce them over what you'd be paying now. Now, they say Donald Trump wants to get rid of citizenship-based taxation. He didn't the first time, and we've talked about that in a separate episode. I'm not sure he would entirely get rid of it if he gets rid of it at all. But Puerto Rico is, particularly for folks who don't have business income, but who have capital gains, dividends, crypto and Bitcoin, money. Puerto Rico is where they go, because if you're an American and you want to get out of paying taxes on your capital gains and dividends, generally the only way to do that is to renounce your U.S. citizenship, which is why having a second passport somewhere else can be a good idea. But if you're okay with living in Puerto Rico, you're committed to multi-years of living there, you actually will live there, which I think a lot of people misunderstand. You actually have to make it your major home. You have to kind of go through a process the way Canadians and Australians and everybody else has to go to, where you're kind of cutting off the U.S. to some extent, and you're making Puerto Rico your home.
If you're willing to do that, 0% dividends once you move. So whenever you've already earned, you can't just easily drag that in. Hey, I held Bitcoin for 10 years. I moved to Puerto Rico for a day and I sold it tax-free. Doesn't work that way. If you run a business, 0 tax on your corporate dividends to yourself, 4% tax on the corporate income itself. Now, there's some rules around that. So Puerto Rico, for Americans, it's kind of easier to move to other countries. It's easier to move overseas than it is for Canadian, Australia, et cetera. The difference is the Canadian, Australian, Brit, whatever, once they get out of their system, they're done. They wipe their hands of it. The American always brings the system with them. And so there's pros and cons to each. But moving to Puerto Rico as an American, to me, is kind of like a Canadian or Australian, leaving their country. There's some things you got to do, and there's some rules you have to follow. And I think people think it's a little bit easier than it is. And that's why, for me, I decided to live where I want. I gave up U.S. citizenship. Tax wasn't really the motivation, but hey, every dollar counts. In my case, tax wasn't particularly the motivation. The bottom line is, if you have capital gains and dividends, and you're an American, and you want to live in Puerto Rico, you can do that. Now, I was American. I chose not to go to Puerto Rico. I ultimately gave up citizenship, which most people don't do. But I've tried to bring a human approach to what we do in working with our clients, where if you call the guy who sells Puerto Rico, the solution to everything is Puerto Rico, and they're going to kind of shoehorn you into that. We have dozens of different options here we developed over the years. One of them is Puerto Rico. And just because I didn't do it doesn't mean we won't help you do it. We've got a great network of people that we've helped clients move to Puerto Rico. But I also believe you should understand your options that are out there in the wide world. That's the approach that I've taken in my personal life. That's the value that you get as a Nomad Capitalist client. Go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply. Learn how we help you get a full slate of options. If you've been thinking of going to Puerto Rico, if you've been thinking of banking in Switzerland, if you've been thinking of doing this or that or the other kind of mainstay thing, perhaps that's what you should do, but perhaps there's options that you haven't considered that would actually be much better for you. That's what we help you uncover. Back to the list. Let's go to Europe now. We've got a couple countries that can be totally tax-free. Number 9, surprisingly to many people, is Ireland. Let me walk you through how this works. Ireland has a non-domiciled tax system. And so if you're from Ireland, this is going to be hard to take advantage of. But if you're just coming in as a foreigner, and that's not the exact criteria, but that's kind of a rough way to look at it. If you're coming in as a foreigner, if you don't really have connections to Ireland, you're going to come in and say, hey, I'm going to be a non-dom taxpayer. And you're going to only pay tax on the money that you remit to Ireland. And so what I've told you about, remittance-based systems is they're best when there's a spread between how much you spend and how much you earn. You make $5 million a year, you live on $500,000 a year. The $4.5 million in that case is untaxed. The $500,000 is taxed at regular rates, which in Ireland go up to about 52%. So you're going to pay about $250,000 in tax in Ireland on your $5 million. Any remittance-based system like Ireland, Malta, Cyprus, even Thailand kind of has this now, are best when you're not spending everything that you earn because you're remitting it in at regular tax rates. But Ireland allows you to set aside what's called tax-free capital, where before you move there, you can segregate a bank account. And there's some nuance to this. This is not tax advice. This is the country you really want to get proper help with. I've seen this. But you can segregate, say, hey, I've got $2 million in a bank account that I had before I moved to Ireland. I'm going to put it over here. I'm not going to add to it. I'm not going to touch it. Whenever I want to bring that money in, I can, and I can do that on a tax-free basis. And so theoretically, it could be any sum of money. If you have $100 million sitting there, you can set it up, and then you could just draw down that $100 million to where theoretically there's never going to be a tax obligation because you never need to remit fresh capital that wasn't segregated before you moved there. So again, better for someone who has some tax-free capital to set aside, better for someone where there's a delta between their earning and their spending. If you don't have any money and you earn $500,000, you spend $500,000, it's probably not a great system for you. It's not going to be tax friendly. But theoretically, you could live in Ireland and not pay tax, and you could get citizenship in 5 years. You already speak the language. Again, you need to live in all these countries. You pretty much need to live there to get the citizenship, with the exception of this Caribbean citizenship by investment programs. Theoretically, for someone who wants that softer landing, Ireland is, of course, an island. And if you become an Irish citizen, you also get the ability to then live in the UK. Also, though, Malta, similar country, similar setup. Malta has a remittance-based non-dom system. For some people, you're going to pay some small amount of tax there. So it may not be entirely tax-free, but there is potentially a way to do it, if not a very minimal annual tax. Number 11, here's one out of left field. The island of Sark. We made a video on this, one of the biggest videos we've ever made. This is the only totally tax-free place in Europe. No income tax, no capital gains tax. Now, there's like, I think it's you and 3 donkeys living there, basically. Go and check out our episode on the only tax-free place in Europe if you want to learn more about Sark. That is somewhat, you're going to be a little bit introverted to want to do that one. But they're really starting to build up a little community of folks who believe in the values of Sark. And it's a very avant-garde sort of place in Europe, in the Channel Islands, technically part of Guernsey, I believe, off of the UK and France. In Asia, a lot of countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, have territorial tax systems. Philippines, if all your income is from foreign sources, potentially could be tax-free. So if your business is overseas, if your investments are overseas, the Philippines could be tax-free because they only tax locally sourced income. The same situation in Singapore. Singapore, yes, the bottom of Peninsular Malaysia is an island. And so if all that income is from foreign sources, you will not pay tax. Singapore has a few more rules on certain things that you want to be aware of, particularly if you have a business that you're working in. And if you move your company to Singapore to facilitate your moving there, Singapore does have a corporate tax that would be payable on all of your corporate income. Lastly, in the South Pacific, another country that grants citizenship by investment, our Nomad Capitalist R&D channel talked about it as a sort of passport of last resort because it has gotten beaten up a little bit in recent years. Vanuatu, not that dissimilar to Sark, very, very few taxes there. I've been there. It is certainly rustic. It is certainly further away. Perhaps if you're from Australia or New Zealand and you want to be able to go back and visit every so often, that's the place for you. Whereas, Caribbean for someone from North America or from London, for example. So Vanuatu in the South Pacific, it's a bit more of a rustic place. It's a bit more of a simple place, and yet it's a beautiful place. And you can live there and pay zero tax. They've got a residence program if you buy property. However, you can just directly make an investment and get citizenship much faster than the Caribbean programs where the due diligence processes have been slowing things down recently. You can probably get a passport there, soup to nuts, in about 3 or 4 months, including paperwork, in Vanuatu. And then you can live there whenever you want. The question when you're getting a passport like that is, where are you banking? And what is your Swiss bank, for example, going to say about you being a citizen of Vanuatu? Because some of those banks will ask you. So you want to keep that in mind. That could be the kind of thing that we would help you. If you're all into Bitcoin and you don't really ever plan on getting into Swiss banking or stuff like that, maybe it doesn't matter. I'm sure you can get a residence permit in plenty of places around the world as a Vanuatu citizen. Now, let me share with you a few runners-up. Thailand itself, not an island, but they have islands, so I'm adding it in. Not totally tax-free anymore. The runners-up are not totally tax-free. Again, if you have a big delta between what you spend in their country and what you make globally, that could be an interesting system, not to be tax-free, but very low tax. Malaysia, not entirely the same remit system, potentially territorial. You might think of Peninsular Malaysia, where I spend time, where Nomad Capitalist Live is held, but Malaysia also occupies the upper third of the island of Borneo, one of the largest islands in the world. Also, other islands where you can have a lump sum, certain tax payment. Jersey in the Channel Islands, Guernsey in the Channel Islands. So that starts at as little as 40,000 pounds. You're going to pay one lump sum tax, earn all you want. There are some strategies in that part of the world. If you're into Bitcoin, you could potentially get lower than that. But for everybody else, you pay one amount of money. So 40,000 pounds. If you make 4 million pounds, your tax rate's 1%. That's pretty close to zero. Those are the four.